Nathan, you're so welcome. Please give him a hand.
Thank you very much, Pam, for the introduction, but also the invitation to be here, and to Vlad also for some of the introductions that he made. What I'm going to talk about today is design, but not how designers do their professional design work in their studios, but how designers think and how other people might try to behave more like designers and use that kind of thinking in their own work. And that's been spoken about for about 20 years or so, this idea of design thinking, that people who aren't designers and who aren't engaging in work that would traditionally be called design can sort of think and act or see the world more like designers. And that might involve them visualizing their ideas, enrolling other people in their projects. It might involve prototyping or making things tangible early and testing them. But of course, none of those are unique to design. Other approaches, other disciplines and practices also behave in that way. So for anyone who is particularly keen, you'll have noticed this isn't actually the title I had. I had a longer title, and we'll come back to this issue of long titles later on. But you can also think of systems thinking. Maybe that's how an ecologist looks at the world, and the ecologist sees all these different entities and how they interact, how they change over time. And even if an ecologist wasn't looking at an ecological challenge or trying to understand a biological ecological system, they might still employ systems thinking in how they looked at the world or imagined possible interventions. And the same with entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs invent or design new business ventures or social ventures, and they also have a particular approach that they bring to problems, and you needn't be starting a new business venture to engage in entrepreneurial thinking. So that was the longer title that I gave Vlad quite a while ago, but if I could, I would have had a much longer title with lots more approaches in that list. I maybe would have filled up the screen there. So the reason I talk about that is because, on the one hand, we might all be coming at the issues we look at or the problems we engage in, bringing some approach. It might be a recognized disciplinary approach, like mathematical thinking or scientific thinking, or any of those three on the screen, or it might be some other approach that's much harder to define. So on the one hand, there's lots of different approaches, and that's what I want to talk about, what those approaches are, but especially how they're related to each other. And in a conference like this, where we're sort of detaching issues like creativity from just psychological traditions and looking at other traditions and how they would approach it, and we're not only studying designers or recognized professionals who imagine new possible problems to work on or new possible solutions, then it's relevant to think about all these different approaches and what they would bring to possibilities that we would consider. The other thing that's worth acknowledging is I'm an engineer by background and I study design. So in fact, the approach I bring to things is probably representative of those two backgrounds. And that applies also to this project. So I probably approached these approaches given the approach that I'm coming from. And I think for some of you that will become obvious as we go through. So let me just contextualize this. So in the Possibility Studies and Society journal, in the opening volume, there was a manifesto from Vlad. No, it's in fact through a manifesto that I came to know Vlad in the first place. And towards the end of that manifesto, once he's outlined lots of different issues and proposals that possibility studies might engage with, he says that this dialogue, the one that is being continued here, is expected to increase the collaboration between psychologists, philosophers, sociologists, anthropologists, linguists, classicists, designers, educators, political scientists, organizational researchers, ergonomists, engineers, and artists. That's quite a long list, but it's good. And of course, the one I'm most familiar with is designers and perhaps engineers. And so we can talk about design thinking in the way that I outlined previously, but we could also talk about anthropological thinking, just taking one more example from that list. And in fact, in the conference session that I was in yesterday after lunch, the term design thinking was used 10 minutes before the term anthropological thinking by two different speakers. And that probably doesn't happen very often in any given room that you would pick within a 10-minute window. So what I'm interested in is not just what, or if we could put to one side the subject matter knowledge that people from these professions or disciplines bring and focus more on the approach that they would bring, then we can look at something that's a bit different to how we normally think about disciplines. So let's jump back to these three of design thinking, systems thinking, entrepreneurial thinking. So for those who've heard of design thinking, it's often resulting from work done in the mid-2000s when Tim Brown from IDEO, which is a design studio, put forward this book, Change by Design, which is really advocating that rather than just seeing design as the sketching of a product or the definition of a service, it brings this much more fundamental set of skills or perspectives that can be used to imagine new business strategies or public policies or educational interventions. All these things could be designed, and lots of people should perhaps imagine that they are designers. So design thinking is quite popular in the business world. There's also systems thinking, looking at Donella Meadows' work on thinking in systems, taking the idea that people who construct system dynamics models, which is a particular quantitative way of modeling how things will play out over time, such as climate change or traffic issues or the population of deer in a forest, and that you can take that way of thinking and apply it to lots of different things, not just to that particular method. And then more recently, we're all being encouraged to be more entrepreneurial, even if we're not starting some social venture, even if we're in a large established organization, perhaps we should think and act entrepreneurially. So we can see that design, systems, and entrepreneurship, you could be walking through an airport and you would see some book that would suggest that you could improve how you engage with the world and perhaps how you improve it by thinking in some other way that might not be the way you're coming from. It's very unlikely that someone who's a professional designer working in a design studio would think that they need to learn about design thinking, but they might think they would learn something about systems thinking, and so on. So these are typically approaches that are aimed at non-experts rather than experts. And in my research, I'm a design researcher, so I've studied designers and how they think and work, but I've also studied systems scientists and systems engineers, but also entrepreneurs who are developing tech startups. So I've got some experience with the actual professional practice of some of these approaches. What I want to highlight here is maybe the story of the journey I went through of trying to understand more than just these three approaches and how they would relate to each other. And there's two sort of starts to that story. So one is that I was working on a concept called co-evolution theory, and that's the idea in design research that designers don't just solve problems, they also change the problems while they solve them. So we would say that the problem and the solution co-evolve. And I was interested in understanding more about this, and especially the biological analogy it's built on. And I read lots of Darwin and other people describing the co-evolution of moths and orchids, and I was trying to understand how that mapped to problems and solutions. And I was really grateful to find this video from Professor Stephen Stearns at Yale, where he didn't just deliver the subject matter knowledge of evolution, he outlined how an evolutionary biologist would think by switching between these three ways of thinking. In this case, we've got typological thinking, so imagining that a given animal is typical of the species it belongs to, so typological. Population thinking, imagining not that things are typical, but everything exhibits variation. And then tree thinking, imagining the descent and inheritance that would give rise to change over time. And as Professor Stearns explains it, if you're trying to understand evolution, you would need to move between these modes of thought, or you would really struggle to grasp and apply the concepts. So I was really grateful as an outsider. Again, these ways of thinking are often promoted to non-experts. As an outsider, I was really grateful to get some clue as to how I should think about the subject matter I was reading, not just trying to learn the subject matter. So that's me as the outsider benefiting from someone explaining a disciplinary approach. But at the same time, or a little bit later, I was developing a course for professionals on creativity. So mid-career professionals would sign up to this course. And when we were developing the course, with my idea for long titles, you can see it sort of growing here, but I wanted not just design thinking, because the course was going to have systems thinking in and entrepreneurial thinking as well. So if someone in a business context wants to be more creative, sometimes it might be really helpful to draw from the design toolbox of maybe trying to understand the end user or visualize your ideas. Sometimes it's really good to think in a systems perspective, where in the system should you intervene? Do you want to focus your attention where you're first, on the thing that first grabbed your interest, or is it really somewhere else in the system that you can have more effect? And then entrepreneurial thinking, if you want to take these ideas and actually push them out into the world, maybe you should behave more entrepreneurially. So I was limited again to a shorter title, so it only has design thinking in the title, but all those other things are in the course, and it's the first time that I started thinking about, well, what's the relationship between these? I'm trying to, in a coherent way, present these to learners for the first time. And the best I could come up with was this, which I thought was rather disappointing. So all I was saying really was, well, they're not all the same as each other, but they're not totally different. But it didn't seem very satisfying at an academic level to just say that then, they're not the same and they're not different. And I see a few people taking pictures. I'll show a barcode at the end where you can get all the graphics that I'll show. But take pictures if you want on your camera roll. So this is really what started the project. I benefited as a recipient of a particular approach, for example, evolutionary thinking, and I was trying to provide those to other people who would benefit. And over the couple of years this course has run, it's clear that professionals who aren't from design or system science or entrepreneurial backgrounds really do get a lot from picking up particular perspectives and particular tools and without becoming fully immersed in the traditions of those disciplines. But when I started trying to look as to how they were related, what I found was that the ones I was familiar with, so design, systems, and entrepreneurial thinking, and to some extent evolutionary thinking, these weren't the only ones available. And some of you will already be familiar with these other perspectives, and we've seen anthropological already from yesterday's talk. What I found was that you can find all sorts of disciplines saying we've got a way of thinking, we've got an approach, often in extremely isolated bits of the literature. So these aren't people who are citing each other. So statistical thinking, thinking geographically, mathematical thinking, historical thinking, the scientific attitude, that's from 1935, but it's really scientific thinking. Computational thinking, which is very big in education, and anthropological thinking, which, as I said, we saw yesterday. So what I discovered, the more I looked into this, was that in fact, almost every discipline has at some point said, well, it's true we've got subject matter knowledge and we've got these very specific sort of discipline-bound tools and methods we use, but we've also got a much more general approach that other people would benefit from, and that we should be teaching these to the students that we teach, not just what's on the curriculum. We need to teach this way of thinking. That's often what these projects are about. And of course, you can take a discipline name like design or entrepreneurship and you can add the word thinking on the end, but that doesn't mean all these people are talking about the same thing, because disciplines are very broad things and the word thinking is not very tightly defined. And in fact, that's one of the drawbacks and benefits of the word thinking here. On the one hand, people aren't talking about the same thing. They do mean quite varying They mean different things when they use the word thinking, but they generally mean let's just step back from the details and look at the general approach. I think that's probably the best way to summarize it. But yeah, we might wonder, are these all really the same kind of thing? When Jackson talks about thinking geographically, is that really the same as Tim Brown talking about design thinking? So there's 4 ways in which I want to say that they generally are talking about the same kind of thing, even if it's not an identical type of thing. So one of the things they're very common on is they say that we're misunderstood. So as a discipline, we're misunderstood. You shouldn't mistake us for our subject matter. We're actually this much more general and applicable and transferable thing. So referring back to Tim Brown, in the design world, a fairly famous quote, historically design has been treated as the point where designers who have played no earlier role in the substantive work of innovation come along and put a beautiful wrapper around the idea. But, he says, design thinking can lead to innovation that goes beyond aesthetics. So we're misunderstood. It's not all about colored pens and sketching. It's actually about having these strategic thoughts and integrating different perspectives, etc. And then Jackson talking about thinking geographically. The public perception of geography is as a fact-based rather than conceptual discipline. This article argues against the view that our discipline is just a gazetteer of place names or a list of imports and exports, and makes the case for the power of thinking geographically. So you can see this across lots of different disciplines. You could look at the literature on computational thinking, and it says, oh, actually, we're not just about writing computer code, we're a mindset. We're a way of thinking about data and how it can be manipulated, even if it's not in a computer. So we're misunderstood. That's certainly one element that draws these literatures or discourses together. Everyone should think like us is another element of similarity. So I use design as the reference point each time, partly because it's more familiar to me, but it's also relevant to possibility studies, perhaps the most popular. So design thinking is not just for architects or product developers, but can be applied across many disciplines to solve real-world problems and reconcile dilemmas, such as in politics and society, business, health, and science, law, and writing. And that's one of the main promotional aspects of design thinking, that irrespective of your background, you might benefit from being a bit more designerly in how you look at and engage with the world. But it's not just design thinking. So computational thinking, and Jeanette Wing, who really popularized the concept, is a fundamental skill for everyone, not just for computer scientists. We should add computational thinking to every child's analytic ability. And in fact, in the computational thinking world, they've actually looked at what are the key characteristics of computational thinking, and how would you teach that in all subjects, arts, sciences, humanities. Focusing on those subjects' disciplines or subject matter, but also allowing them to think computationally when they do so. So we're misunderstood. Everyone should think like us. But how we think is actually a bit hard to define. And that's really common. So there's a lot of confusion and debate and issues in, let's say, the world of design thinking, lots of debate about what does it really mean? Is it this 5-hexagon model that's a process? Is it this table of different skills? And so it's really common in the design thinking literature to have this acknowledgement of the confusion that exists. So there is a lack of consensus amongst prominent champions of design thinking about its precise definition, say Patel and Mehta. Similarly, at the end of a quite long book on mathematical thinking, Sternberg says, in reading through the chapters of this volume, it becomes clear that there is no consensus on what mathematical thinking is, nor even on the abilities or predispositions that underlie it. So again, it's hard to define what it is, but it's important to everyone, and everyone should do it. And then, central to what I'm going to go on to say next, although it's hard to define exactly what design thinking or systems thinking or entrepreneurial thinking, etc. are, we can break it down into some components. And maybe not any one of those components is unique, but taken together, they're relatively distinctive. So let's look at a list of components for design thinking. So someone might say, well, design thinking is characterized by having creativity and innovation at its core. Perhaps designers are user-centered. They empathize with who the user is, and that drives their creative process. Designers solve problems. And you can see already that not any of these would necessarily be unique. But when you put them together with a longer list, this one from McKelly et al., then we might think that, well, sure, designers do that more than some other disciplines do. And we can compare that to systems thinking, which also is sometimes broken down into a list of components. So we would move our attention from focusing just on the parts to focusing on the whole, might be one aspect of systems thinking. Maybe it's inherently multidisciplinary as a practice. We shift our attention from objects to the relationships between them. That'd be a typical systems thinking approach. And again, although any of those might not be unique when we collect them together, they might be distinctive. So it's not that either of these lists is the definition of what design thinking is or what systems thinking is, because there's lots of other lists, other diagrams and debates, but they're representative in some way of the discourse about what design thinking or systems thinking might be. So the issue I started with was, it's fine that you can find these things, but how are they related? And the challenge is that all these literatures are so isolated from each other that they aren't defined relatively. It's very rare that you would find someone who, well, here's what design thinking is in comparison to entrepreneurial thinking and in comparison to systems thinking. You sometimes find pairs being compared, although it's quite rare, but it's very rare to find a set larger than 2 being compared, like 3 or 4 or 5 approaches all being connected to each other. So the question that I was still working on was, how are they related? And of course, the reason I think this is relevant to a conference like this is you have all these different disciplines here in terms of the practices that you bring to the projects you're describing, but you're also studying different practices. So when you speak to each other, the approaches you bring and the approaches you're studying might be valuable to connect to each other. Not necessarily in the way that I've done it, but this might be a useful basis for thinking about perhaps how you don't want to do it. So first of all, I tried to get a sense, as searching across 30 or so of these different disciplinary approaches, I'll call them, what was the relative popularities? This is a simple title, keyword, and abstract search in Scopus. There's other ways of doing it, of course. And it largely confirmed what I thought, which is that things like design thinking and systems thinking are very popular. They're discussed quite a lot, and more so than things like historical thinking and statistical thinking. But this is for them being discussed in isolation. And if we just take one of those numbers, so 9,226 papers on systems thinking, if we look at the same title, abstract, and keyword search, but now look at when they appear in combination rather than in isolation, we now have 9,049 for systems thinking, and a few thousand for the others. So that's just when they're in isolation. Once you start looking for works that are talking about 2 at once, then the numbers drop pretty quickly. And once you want more than 2, then they drop really low. So you might not find a single paper. Again, this is just title, abstract, and keyword, but it's useful to get a sense of the literature. There's lots of these things being discussed in isolation. There's not much of it being discussed in combination. You can do a similar analysis looking at who cites who, so citation analyses or co-citation analyses. And if, for example, you took the most cited work in design thinking and the most cited work in computational thinking, you might find no published work that cites both of those together. And the same for the other approaches. So they're very separate as literatures. You get that sense when you read them. You get that sense when you start doing some basic bibliometric searches as well. But like I said, it's not that there's nothing in the intersections. So design thinking, systems thinking, and entrepreneurial thinking has the number 4 in it. So you can find some papers where they at least mention those, and you might find that they have some comparison. So here's a Venn diagram that's better than the one that I started with. It's actually got some components in it, so it says a bit more than not the same and not totally different. But if you look at the actual components that are in there, they're very specific to not so much an approach, but what those people actually work with, algebra, geometry, etc. Maybe problem solving, which is the top one in the intersection, is the one that sounds more like something related to a general, a creative approach or possibility-oriented approach. In a completely disconnected but structurally identical diagram, this one looking at systems thinking and design thinking, again has some components in there, so achieving things that I didn't at the outset. But again, one of the issues we have is because these things have traditionally been studied in isolation, when you look at what those components are, they aren't all at the same level of abstraction, they're not really describing the same kind of thing. Even something like interaction of components in systems thinking, that might be something that a systems thinker pays attention to. But if we look at interaction with the user and usability on the right-hand side, on design thinking, that's actually something that the designer or the design thinker would do, not something they would pay attention to. So it's often the case, even within a discipline, that you get these very disparate lists, and it makes it very hard to tie down what you're really talking about, which is why the word thinking is almost always in inverted commas when you read it, even if it's not written that way. So these are the sorts of things I was finding. There's not many of them, but they're useful, especially for these pairwise comparisons. So what's design thinking and anthropological thinking that we heard yesterday in the afternoon session. It doesn't show you how those are related, but it shows you how you might want to map them if that was an important thing for you to consider or discuss. So I started sketching out some other kinds of map, and I'll zoom into this in a moment. But what you see in the center is design thinking. It's the Crilly et al. List that we saw in a moment. And again, I'll put up a barcode so you can get the vector graphics if you want them. And then we've got these other 7 disciplinary approaches around the outside. So you can see here that something that's often described as being really unique to design. If you go into a design research conference, you'll hear abductive reasoning mentioned as though it's really unique to design. But really the conjecturing that goes on in mathematical thinking might be quite similar, like putting forward a possibility and then testing it. And so we see that it might not be so unique. In fact, if we look at this Crilly et al. List for design thinking, you can see that every single component of that list is mapped to one of the other 7 approaches that appear around the outside. So when we think about collaboration in groups, or we think about what really makes an approach distinctive, we might want to think about them in these relative terms. And again, any one of these lists might not be definitive, but it might just be representative of that discipline. So we could map them like this. We could say, what collection of disciplines are we interested in? For you, it needn't be any of these ones. It could be some other set of approaches that you're interested in. And you can start thinking about what are the components they're built out of, how are they related to each other, how unique is one approach, or how much does it overlap with another. So partly because of my background and my interests, and partly because of what's popular, it's those 4 on the right-hand side that I was most interested in. So design, systems, and entrepreneurial. And I added in computational for something different to try and test myself a bit beyond just 3 approaches. So the next thing I tried to do is, but one thing I haven't done here on the right-hand side is that design is linked to everything else, but everything else is not linked to each other. So what's the connection between systems thinking and entrepreneurial thinking? That's not represented here. So I went through another iteration, and in this case, I tried to aggregate a few descriptions. Because the descriptions aren't all the same as each other, even for one disciplinary approach, it's helpful to try and combine them and refine them and make them a bit more similar to each other at the component level. So this is one particular aggregation of design thinking, but again, you could construct other ones. One for systems thinking. Again, it's just a list, but it's just arranged that way so it fits on the screen. One for entrepreneurial, and one for computational. And just to make things a bit more even-handed, I've got 14 components for each, so we don't get, a very rich description of one discipline and a very partial description of another. And then you can map the connections between them for the things that seem similar or the things that seem different. I'll just zoom into that so you can see it. So just to take one example, adopt an integrative perspective, which design thinkers describe as quite unique to design, but not unique relative to anything else, just unique in absolute terms, and adopt a holistic perspective on systems thinking. Maybe those two things are pretty similar, and that's a connection between how a systems thinker and a design thinker might approach things. Of course, someone might be both of those approaches at once. And when we look at this, there's a number of issues that come up, we'll get to in a moment. But one thing we can look at is that we could find any particular component that perhaps belongs to all four of these. So being experimental and iterative, sort of modeling things, testing them, that way of making progress, even though it might be described as characteristic of each of them, actually ends up being characteristic or a feature of all of them. But again, just of these four, you could choose other disciplinary approaches to connect. On the other hand, we could find components that do seem within this collection to be relatively unique and perhaps distinctive compared to the others. So what have we got here? Along the top there, we've got engage in modularization and reuse, so imagining things as small parts that you can separate out and then put back together. You might see that in engineering thinking, but that's not on this table. But perhaps you see it less in design, entrepreneurship, and systems. But one of the issues with that is that really what we're mapping here is the discourse. So if I pick up the discourse on design thinking or systems thinking, this might be what they say. But because those weren't relative literatures, you don't know whether this is really what someone would say about their approaches. So if you showed this map to a collection of people, each of whom represented one of those approaches, would they all agree that modularity is really something for computational and the rest of them would want to wash their hands of it? Perhaps not. But as far as I can tell, that's not the sort of work that's gone on. People haven't collected different disciplines together and said, thrash it out amongst yourselves, what really makes your approaches unique. Instead, they've been derived rather in a fragmented or isolated way. So I expect many of you already find that there's some things that aren't very satisfying about this. And I mentioned earlier, coming from a design or an engineering background, maybe this looks a bit like a wiring diagram. So if you ask me, how should disciplines be related? Maybe I think they should be related in this fairly engineering-ish way. And perhaps people here would see other ways of imagining the representation of the relationships, if they, in fact, think that's a useful approach. So what's wrong with doing this sort of thing and what's missing? So as I just mentioned, on the one hand, you're limited to the literature that exists, because that's where these descriptions of disciplinary approaches are, and those descriptions aren't relative, therefore it's very hard to make a coherent set to do the comparison with. And it's not really derived from empirical comparative work, which I think would be the best way forwards. But also, that was just 4 approaches. You might want to say that there's 9 or 20 or 30 that you're interested in. They might be disciplines and subdisciplines, so maybe not just design in general, but maybe you want a graphic design approach compared to an engineering design approach. You might have interdisciplines like synthetic biology, which imagines the complex systems you could build from biological parts. So there's all these different disciplines, subdisciplines, and so on that aren't represented, and there's many more than just 4. And there's also lots of things missing, because these are just component-based descriptions which might not fully represent what we want. The other thing that's missing, and at a conference like this I think it's relevant, is ways of thinking that aren't disciplinary, so possibility thinking being a clear example. So again, when I was on this journey of going through the literature, clearly critical thinking is a kind of thinking that pops up when you read a lot about thinking. And it's quite similar in many ways in terms of we want to teach critical thinking in ways that are transferable. So can you teach critical thinking skills in one domain, then have the learners apply it somewhere else? That's a key issue of consideration. But you find possibility thinking, possibilistic thinking, this idea of inventive thinking, futures thinking. There's lots of kinds of thinking that are central to the sorts of discussions that are happening here. And maybe it's those kinds of thinking you'd want to map to each other, or maybe you'd want to find those in the components of disciplinary approaches. So you could imagine either a spectrum or 2 categories of approach. One would be disciplinary, what does an engineer or a designer bring to an issue, and the other might be non-disciplinary or higher order thinking skills. And you might want to imagine that maybe you could break any of those down, and just all you want is a component of useful ways of engaging with possible problems or possible solutions, and maybe you don't care too much where it originates from. So I think you can take something like a diagram like this just as a point of departure, showing that you could try and do it if you wanted to, or you'd find it difficult in certain ways. But I think the more relevant thing at a conference like this is to sort of ask yourself, what ways of thinking or what approaches am I most interested in, and what other ones should I relate them to, and how should I construct those representations? Should they be graphical? Should they be interactive? Should they involve this sort of wiring diagram or Venn diagram or some other language altogether? And then what would we want to do with those representations we would construct? Is it that we'd want to help people learn new approaches by showing them where they're coming from? One of the features of design thinking is it's often given without any recognition of where the audience is coming from. But what I've found in the professional course I run is that you have people coming with all these different backgrounds, and they've got their own way of doing things. They've got a legal approach that they bring to the subject matter that wasn't necessarily there in their curriculum, but it's what they've developed through their professional practice. Or they've got a managerial approach. So people come to the world already with an approach, and if you want to add another one, it's useful to recognize where they're coming from and what you're adding in that way. So we could have it for educational purposes. It could be for team composition. Do we form teams just on the basis of subject matter expertise? Or do we also recognize that a mix of approaches is valuable on top of or separate to that? So we can look at these things in terms of how we would design studies, what we would study, and what kind of information we would generate that would allow us to construct useful maps to help people navigate not just disciplinary subject matter, but also disciplinary approaches. So that's what I wanted to run through. Thanks a lot for listening. I will be around this morning and also at dinner, and then again on Friday for any discussions that anyone wants to have. There's the barcode for anyone that wants it.
Nathan, thank you. An exemplification of literature reviewing for all of us, Put your hands up if you're a master's and doctoral student. Okay, really, you're in the right place today. Nathan, that was exemplifying really how you handle the ever increasing literatures and knowledge production and how to make sense of it and synthesize it in a beautiful way. Very concise, really unpacking stuff. Okay, number one.
Hi, Peter, Aarhus University.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's a really interesting and great overview. I'm wondering about this notion of talking about all of these things as thinking. What do you think that foregrounds and what do you think that kind of obscures? Because it would seem to me that one of the crucial things about design thinking is that designers, they use resources in the world all the time to externalize their thoughts, to develop, share ideas, and so on. And I also teach courses on design thinking, but it often seems to me that maybe it's a linguistic deficit that we don't have a way of talking about thinking and acting in the same verb, but that seems to be, at least to be one core component of design thinking. And I imagine the same thing might be true of many of these other ways of thinking, where in practice it would seem that it is about much more than thinking, unless we have a very expansive view of what thinking is.
Great question.
Yeah, very good, thanks. So I agree. I think that's maybe the first thing to get out there. A lot of the approaches, but not all of them, use that discipline thinking construction. There are others that don't quite use the same thing. And even those that do use that construction sometimes replace it for mindset or some other word. So I think if you looked across all the literatures that I've read, across all the approaches, you would get things like thinking, you would get mindset, disposition, inclination, habits of mind, etc. And some of them just become practices and don't refer to anything. So I was just using the word approach to sort of lump everything under that heading and not tie yourself to this sort of cognitive idea of it's a thought process or it's a way of thinking. I think the challenge comes in just rhetorically that you're talking about lots of things that have got the word thinking on the end, so you end up calling them the thinkings or thinking approaches. But I agree, I think it's a bit misleading. And especially if someone thinks, oh, that's a way of thinking, I should go and take that course because I will then think differently, and it's purely cognitive, purely intellectual. A lot of what they'll encounter, not just for design thinking, wouldn't line up with that. So yeah, I agree. I think it's unfortunate in many ways that they've taken that naming, but that does seem to be the naming that 80% of them are taken. Yeah.
Hello, Tom Ormerod. Thank you, Nathan. That was brilliant, really interesting and really useful. It struck me that a lot of the papers you were summarising were talking either about bits of design or bits of systems that we need to think about, or they were talking about thinking tasks we carry out in these domains. And it was only in your later slides I thought that we captured the notion that there might be a designerly thinking. And the question that follows from this little monologue is, do you think that if you took a designer or a systems thinker and put them in a totally different domain, their thinking would be different? I mean, one example of that is abductive thinking. You know, designers say we do abductive thinking, but most medical diagnosis is abductive thinking as well. So what happens when you take a designer out of their natural ecology? Do they carry on design thinking?
Yeah, great question. I think there's some evidence that when you take people from one background, such as design, from a design studio, and then you give them a class of problem that's not the class they've traditionally been trained on, they do bring things to that class of problem that those around them who are used to working on that problem class don't bring. But whether that's exactly the same approach or way of thinking that they were exhibiting in the studio, it seems unlikely to me that you don't more flexibly adapt your way of thinking as you move it to new contexts. But I think what we haven't seen yet, because there's quite a few studies, let's say with designers, let's give them a class of problem and study them, or just empirically, let's see what happened when design thinking became popular and designers started working on the UN's SDGs, for example. And same for entrepreneurs. They give entrepreneurs a problem, they study how they approached it, sometimes as distinct from some general public that isn't defined as having an approach. I think what we don't have is studies where you would take a particular class of problem and give it to several professions from different backgrounds to approach and see what distinguishes them and see what usefully you could draw from a computer scientist's approach to school meals for children as compared to a designer's and so on. So I think you will see distinctions in the approaches that people bring based on their background, but I don't think that will stay the same when you move them between different classes of problem. Does that get to the question? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Question 3.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Min Tan, originally from China, but working in Germany. So I'm a creativity researcher. So at the beginning of your talk, I look for creative thinking, innovative thinking. I didn't see it. But we can see creativity, innovation, imagination everywhere related to design thinking. My question is curiosity, because creative thinking or divergent thinking was actually can be dated back to 1950s, Guilford. But design thinking was actually mid of 2000. So my question is curiosity, is creativity, innovation the means to design as the end, or the other way round? For me, is creativity and innovation are the end, and design is one of the means to achieve creativity and innovation. But why is the situation is other way around? Is like creativity and innovation is below design thinking. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Great question. Thank you very much. I think... So what I would like to do is construct a much bigger map of the one I showed and have it interactive so that you could click on design and it would arrange it around design, or you could click on creativity and it would arrange everything around that, for example. And that's the way I've normally thought about the literature as I've gone through it, that you can find curiosity or problem solving or creativity occurring in lots of these disciplinary approaches. And I think for anyone interested in how would I be more creative or how should I study creativity, it's perhaps a matter of breaking down all those disciplinary distinctions and saying, what does every different disciplinary approach or other approach bring to creativity? You know, what can I learn from the way that computer scientists solve problems or imagine problems as distinct from design, entrepreneurship, etc.? So certainly I don't see that it's that design is superior to creativity or that one is subservient to the other, but you can divide things up in lots of different ways. The literature has tended to divide them up in very disciplinary ways within certain bits of the literature. So I think that's how I would see it. But I think it's really the case that historically I feel that creativity has been seen and emphasized very much in one subset of professions and practices and not so much in others. But actually when lots of those disciplines say, oh, actually we've got an approach, what you see in there is creativity, whether that's maths or design. Yeah.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for those questions. Now we have 5 minutes over time, so we're going to have to be very creative with our time management. We have coffee. Thank you so much for this.